Why South Sudan? An Every Village podcast where we answer questions about the world's youngest nation. The question of the day is, what is the history of South Sudan? Hello, everyone. My name is Tiana Johnson. I am the host of this podcast called Why South Sudan? And I have Andrew Brown, the executive director, back here with me.
Awesome to be here.
So good to have you back. So today our question is, what is the history of South Sudan? So there's really nobody else better in this organization beside the South Sudanese to ask about the history, as you've been here almost 16 years. So you have seen the highs and the lows.
That's for sure.
So I think it'd be good just to kind of have a picture of what is South Sudan, what has it been, what is it even looking like today. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks. And, oftentimes when I do give a history of South Sudan, I like to break it into kind of two spheres, kind of a political history and then a church history. And I think both are relevant to our work for sure. Mm-hmm. Starting with the political history, South Sudan was, or let me say, South Sudan before it existed as a nation was a region called Southern Sudan, which was a part of Sudan, which was all one nation. And at the time, Sudan was the largest country in Africa, geographically.
Oh wow!
And yet it was a British colony, and as so many of the African colonized nations were, they were formed without really a thought towards tribal lines at all. They were just geographical boundaries that didn't make a lot of sense with regard to tribal distribution, and that was the case for Sudan. If you put a draw line right across the middle of Sudan, you had Southern Sudan, and you had, what we call as Sudan today, but Northern Sudan, and the people groups are very different. Northern Sudanese are lighter-skinned Arabic Africans. It's part of the Sahara Desert, and Southern Sudan is very rainy and lush during the rainy season. It gets arid during the dry season, but certainly not a desert. And the native people are, native Africans, very dark-skinned, some of the darkest-skinned Africans in the world, mm-hmm. and there's a lot of tiny tribes that are interspersed. And so, when the British ruled as a colony, already there was kind of the beginning grounds of conflict between the two major groups in that region, and so Sudan gained independence from British rule in 1957, but even before that, in 1956, they had broken into civil war between the North and the South. And that first civil war lasted from 1956 to 1972. Wow. And the civil war really, there were so many layers to it, as there are for many wars, but there was, geopolitical levels, there was natural resources, there's a lot of oil right in the middle grounds, there was religious and ethnic aspects to the conflict. So many different layers that led to that civil war. In 1972, they signed a peace agreement called the Addis Ababa Accord in Ethiopia, and came to a ceasefire and an agreement on things. And then that lasted for just over 10 years. And then in 1983, the Civil War broke out once again between the North and the South. And that second Civil War lasted from 1983 to 2005.
Wow.
So if you think about it, from 1956 to 2005, 50-year period, they only had 10 years of peace. Pretty amazing. And that's what led to the lack of development that South Sudan has experienced. There's a lot of developing nations in East Africa that are behind maybe other parts of the world, but they still have had seasons of extended peace where there's been development. And maybe they went backwards for a time due to civil unrest or other things, but they've continued to progressively. There's a trend line up. South Sudan really hasn't had a trend line up. It's just been a flat line for their entire course of their history. And so 2005, they signed a second peace agreement called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And in 2005, the United States was a big player in that peace agreement. And they agreed to a 6-year interim period where Southern Sudan was created as a semi-autonomous region. And they had their own president of Southern Sudan who answered to the president of Sudan. And at the end of 6 years, they were going to have votes on a few different things. But first, they were going to have a vote to draw the boundary lines between Southern Sudan and Sudan. And then they were going to have a vote for secession. And in January of 2011 rolls around, and they never had that vote to draw the boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
It was canceled. And then still today, they've never had it. That's important because, again, I mentioned all the huge oil fields are right kind of in that disputed territory. And so, but they went ahead with the vote for secession, and 99.9% of South Sudanese or Southern Sudanese voted for secession. And so in July in 2011, South Sudan became the world's newest country. They seceded from Sudan. And so the two countries are distinct now, South Sudan and Sudan. Every village works exclusively in South Sudan. And so that's just kind of the brief history leading up to independence. Then, there was so much hope for the new nation that now that in many ways, actually, the South Sudanese saw themselves as kind of the story of the Israelites in the Exodus. They'd been freed from their slave masters, and now they could move to the Promised Land. And so there was a lot of hope in those years, and I was working there at that time. Unfortunately, the bitterness, the corruption, the greed among leaders didn't lead to a strong foundation. And so they were supposed to have an election. They never had an election. Even to today, they've still not had an election as a country. And so the president of South Sudan was just appointed during that 6-year interim period. And so they've never had any democratic process. And the vice president during those years was a man who was from a tribe that was historically an opposition tribe to the tribe of the president. Mm-hmm. Well, that lasted only so long. And in 2013, the president sacked the vice president. And then a few months later, there was a coup attempt, the vice president trying to overthrow the president. And this new nation, only less than 2 years old, broke into civil conflict that spread across the nation and really fractured the nation. And that 2013 break into civil war really lasted. And there were several iterations of a revitalized peace agreement. It was officially finally signed in 2018, the revitalized peace agreement, but wasn't even really fully implemented until 2020, where you started to see peace and stability return again. But the ironic thing is none of those original issues have been solved, because now South Sudan still has the same president, and that vice president who had gone on the run for several years and been out of the country is back once again as vice president. And in fact, there's 4 other vice presidents now. So South Sudan has 1 president and 5 vice presidents. So politically, it's still a mess, and there's still a lot of uncertainty. But thankfully, we don't put our hope in those things, mm-hmm. Because God's the king on his throne. And so that's what leads then to the church history of South Sudan, which is equally important when you look at what God's doing in that nation. And so, in short, there were originally some missionaries that came in 1850s, but just on a small level, and that's the first time the gospel ever entered that region in Sudan. But then they came back in 1901, and the Catholic missionaries, the Presbyterian missionaries, and the Episcopal missionaries came together and agreed to kind of divide the nation up into 3 spheres for missions. And so the northwest portion was the Catholic missionaries, the northeast portion was the Presbyterian missionaries, and then the central region of South Sudan was the Episcopal missionaries. Mm-hmm. And you still see that very strongly today in terms of the church in South Sudan, is those regions kind of are represented by those main church denominations, and so those missionaries kind of worked there from the early 1900s through the 1950s, and then when Civil War broke in 56, really the last missionaries were basically kicked out by the early 1960s, and there was a long stretch where there were no missionaries, but the gospel seeds have been planted, and so the church continued to grow during those seasons, and then peace, of course, returned again in the 70s, and missionaries returned, and then 1983, when the Second Civil War broke out again, it was until the late 80s when the last missionaries were kicked out once again because of the civil unrest. But once again, those seeds continue to bear fruit. And in fact, in the 90s is when a mass awakening happened in South Sudan, and there was mass conversions, people coming to the Lord. And it was really the first time where there had been Southern Sudanese who had fled the country in previous years, received an education, received the gospel, and then they started coming back in those late 80s and bringing the gospel to their people. And you started seeing, the church, the modern church born. And so one of the things that's important for us to remember in our work is that the Christians of today in South Sudan, almost all of them are first-generation Christians. Mm-hmm. And they've only been Christians for 30 years or not long. And so the issues that we deal with in the church in South Sudan are first generation issues that you would experience of a new church.
Mm-hmm.
They're wrestling with things that you read about in the book of Acts.
Mm-hmm.
And so it requires an understanding of that history to go about the work properly. And so one of the challenges that led to it was incredible that the gospel spread in such a way and the church just started exploding. But because of that, the local leaders started doing mass ordinations as well because they needed pastors, but they just started taking volunteers, people that raised their hand and said, I'll be a pastor, but they didn't necessarily even know how to read. They certainly didn't have the Bible. They didn't have any theological education, but they were willing hearts. Well, that's commendable, but unfortunately, it's led to a real shallow level of pastoral leadership. They haven't been taught. They don't know, and so that's led to the church of today, which the people are very hungry, and really across South Sudan, you see from top levels of society to bottom levels of society, people understand the importance of the gospel, and they're very open to the things of God. They want more training. They want more spiritual investment. They just don't know how to get there because they lack leaders that have been trained. And so that's where, ministries like Every Village, and there's so many other ministries that are working in South Sudan, they're focused on training pastors and church leaders, and that's so important to help see a healthy church grow because, we don't want to just see the church grow. We want to see churches grow in health in South Sudan. And so that's kind of the intermarrying of the political history and the church history in South Sudan.
Mm-hmm. For anyone that is tuning in, just a little background information here is that Andrew is not reading anything. That was purely all out of his brain. He shared all of that information very clearly. So good job.
Well, thanks. I've been living it a long time, and believe me, I'll just tell one more story that's more personal. I was living in Kampala, Uganda, with Every Village from 2015 to 2017. We have a regional support office there. And during those years, I worked really closely day in, day out with Daniel Lawal, who's now our country director. And he's a South Sudanese who lives in Kampala, and it's just an amazing man of God. If you know Daniel, some of you have had the chance to meet him as he's come to Houston multiple times. But all that to say, we spent a lot of time praying together every day for our work. And I remember 2016 was by far the hardest year in South Sudan since I had started working there, which was 2008. And after 8 years of pouring out my life for the people of South Sudan, I saw the country going backwards. 2016 it was a renewal of conflict, so 2013 was the spark, but it kind of started to levelize off in 2014, 2015, and then in 2016, once again, there was a huge blow up of violence, and that spread across the nation and fractured, and there suddenly were tons of rebel groups, independent militias basically, that spread. And then because of that, the roads weren't safe. Because of that, there wasn't access to commodities and trade. And so then inflation just hit hard. And in 2016, South Sudan experienced the second highest hyperinflation in the world behind Venezuela. And so I don't remember the exact figures, but it was something like at the beginning of 2016, the exchange rate was 5 South Sudanese pounds to $1. By the end of the year, it was over 100. Just insane level of inflation. Well, that meant that people suddenly had no access to food or product that they needed. So mass starvation. It was over 2 million people were in risk of starvation that year. So anyway, Daniel and I were going through this together, and we were just depressed, honestly. And we were just thinking, are we making a difference? What are we doing here? It's going backwards, not forwards. And I remember God, in his kindness, in our prayer time, we just felt beat down. But as God does so kindly and so often in our prayer times, he encouraged us in that moment by his Spirit. And I remember him just kind of reminding us of this truth, that we are working for something that we won't even see the full fruit of in our lifetime, and that's okay. We are working for something that's going to outlive us. We're trying to lay the foundation stones and invest in the next generation, and it takes time. And, building a nation for Christ takes time, and that's okay if we don't see all the benefit of our work. It's worth it still. We're still committed to this, and that was a really it was a bedrock moment of clarity in my mind that gave me the strength to continue working in this nation and to, I guess, be stable through the ebbs and flows. South Sudan has had its highs. It's had its lows in my time, and it's going to keep having those. And yet I know that we're working for things that we're not even going to see. And that's, man, that's so biblical too. That's what the founders of the faith did. And Hebrews 11 talks about Abraham, who was working for a city whose foundations he could just see far off in the distance by faith, but he never received it in his lifetime, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the type of thing we're working towards. And finally, I just, then am reminded of our founder, Frank Blackwood, was sitting with me one time, just encouraging me in the work. And I love Frank, and he's kind of a history buff, and he was talking about the formation of the United States. And if we remember, the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, but it wasn't until 1789 when the Continental Constitution was formed, or the Continental Congress came together and formed the Constitution of the United States and formed a nation. It was 13 years, and that was the United States coming out of the world's most prosperous empire, the British Empire, the world had ever seen. They were educated, they were wealthy, they had their own plots of land, they had everything they need to form a society, and it still took them 13 years to define where they were headed as a nation. And South Sudan is coming out of, years of war without any infrastructure, without any education. It's going to take time.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are, and we're 12 years in, and it's going to be longer, but it's okay. But this is what, the unique opportunity we have to pour into this nation.
Mm-hmm. I love just hearing the overview, honestly, because again, it's such a depiction of scripture. It's such the story of God, that God is the highs and the lows, but he's in every detail. So even hearing, the history of the missionaries, or even the fighting that happened, and then there was a gap of peace. And then even with the missionaries, then missionaries were, kind of cast out and everybody had to leave, but then the church blew up. And that is that is the Bible. Like, that is the story that God writes. And just seeing big picture of what he's doing in South Sudan, even for us, that we get the gift of getting to go there every year, getting to go see what God is doing on the ground, and seeing, especially now, like the youth have such a passion for peace. Like, they truly want unity. They don't want division. They hate seeing the fighting that's continuously, happening currently. Or even just the church. I mean, seeing just true believers to come through, because even that, like, a lot of animism and witchcraft is still ingrained in their culture, so that it's even then taken into the church. And so it's similar even here to America. There's a lot of new age that falls into the church because people want to pick and choose, but that's where the truth of God that really, really is so important for the depth of that. So I love that Every Village gets to come in and really be that support pillar to what God is already doing in South Sudan. I think a lot of our role at Every Village really is support. It's just a pillar of what God's already doing, that we just get to be just a support to the foundation.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's right. And it's a privilege to be a part of, for sure. So, I mean, that's the thing. Any beautiful story has pain in it. And God, through the history of South Sudan, has forged such an inner strength in the people, a resilience in the people of South Sudan. And I really have never met a people that are stronger in their core than the South Sudanese because of the suffering that they've been through. But God is going to use that for great good in the future, and we can't wait to see it.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. I love that so much. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, I think that really helps us kind of even step forward into the podcast of, what else does this ministry look like? What else is God doing in South Sudan? And I think this was a vital podcast to really hear and to see big picture of what God is doing and the part that we get to play into it. So thank you so much for sharing, Andrew. Again, your brain blows my mind how you know all of that. But thank you for joining us. I hope you come back next time as we answer the question, what is the history of Every Village? Take care.